What value is there in having a standard, or is there?
Oh, I think there's a value in having a standard language. And I think there's actually a value in having a standard language that's a little bit different from the spoken language of everybody, which it is. The language that you write, if you're writing an op-ed for the New York Times, is not the language you use even if you're a professor teaching a class or if you're sitting in the boardroom of a corporation. There really is a difference. And I think it's important that there be a difference because I think that while in ordinary conversation we speak and ought to speak unselfconsciously, when we're doing certain kinds of writing or public speaking, we want to think much more self-consciously about language. And if the rules are a little bit different, if we have to stop and think, that's a good thing.
Why is it good to stop and think about it in the one context and not the other?
Well, because when you're writing, for example, an op-ed for the New York Times, you're going to write it more slowly. You want to organize your thoughts more carefully. It's something you're going to spend a lot of time working on so that the reader will be able to take exactly the message. Because in writing, you don't have the context that's usually available in speech that does a lot of the work in understanding what's being said. Let me give you an example. The dangling modifier, that bugbear of grammar. In ordinary speech, we do that all the time. There is nobody who has not dangled a modifier in the last 48 hours. Let me say that. Coming into the station, there was smoke coming out of the train. Well, if you wrote that, you'd say, oh no, that's a dangling modifier. You'd have to turn it around. In speech, it works fine. In writing, where you're paying more attention and where the structure has to be one that requires less effort and it allows more efficiency on the part of the reader, all of a sudden that jumps out at you. So what's interesting is that we notice these things, if we're experienced writers and editors. In written prose, we don't notice them at all when they go by in speech. The rules are different, and they should be different. Every standard language will have, and particularly in the written language, will have certain features that have evolved or emerged in answer to the particular requirements of that form of language, the way it's being used. If it's something that's being understood asynchronously, as people say, that is to say, if I'm writing and taking my time to write a sentence and then you're reading it later and taking your time to read it, I have lots more at my disposal. I can think carefully how I want to express this, what word I want to use, what construction I want to use. I can use much longer sentences and much more complex sentences. I have punctuation, which is a fascinating phenomenon. I wrote a book on punctuation once. We have semicolons, we have colons, we have the dash, we have parentheses. So we have all of these devices, paragraphs, sentences, and so on, for organizing and structuring a written text, to bring out its structure more directly, to make it easier to process, to allow it to carry the burden of arguments that are far too complicated to make in speech and that are too hard to follow when they're spoken. So in that sense, the standard of any language is going to have all kinds of resources that make it different from the spoken varieties that surround it.